selfishness is saying, I don't care. Selfhood, two people saying, this is what's true. I mean, bring it down to where you're going to dinner. I don't really feel like eating this tonight. It can be really small things. There's some honesty there, but there's also honoring.
Dr. Alison Cook, welcome to the podcast. I love your last name.
I know. I have a cousin named Chris Cook, actually.
Come on.
Yeah, I do. He's a great guy.
There are a few of us in the world, I think.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Really thrilled to talk to you, Chris.
It's so good to meet you. Well, I've really, as I told you moments ago, I've really been looking forward to this. So here's where I want to start. As you look at the state of our collective mental and emotional health today, what sticks out to you now that's maybe different than a couple years ago? Do you see any particular trends in people today, or any core issues that are just poking through the surface of people's hearts?
I think the trends have been there, but I think we're more aware of loneliness, isolation, anxiety that comes as a result of that. And I think a lot of that relates to coming out of the pandemic. I think those things, the seeds for those things have been there for a while, and then kind of just the veil was lifted, with the pandemic. So I think we're really seeing just a lot of the results of a lot of isolation, a lot of loneliness, again, that was there before the pandemic and then got magnified.
I love that. And if we could just kind of shine a light on this a little bit more, as a professional, I'd love your take on this. We live with these seeds in our hearts for so long that we don't recognize their origin, and then circumstances, people, events, relationships, etc., exacerbate their presence. It causes them, like a seed in soil, to push through the soil of our hearts. How do we begin to recognize these seeds of issues, and why do they live so much under the surface?
I think if you want to go really zoom out to a 30,000-foot view, I've thought a lot about this because I am one of that generation that moved around a lot. I was kind of that first, my parents' generation. You're kind of born, you're raised, you live in the same town, community kind of is, you don't really think about it. It's just there. And then my generation, Gen X, we sort of just started living everywhere. My friends live all over the country. None of us live in the same place. Technology comes in. You're all keeping in touch remotely, and all of that. And so again, the seed of, I remember many moments in my, 20s and 30s, primarily in my 30s, going, wait a minute, I am completely disconnected from anyone on the ground where where I live. Everything is, that doesn't feel right. So how do I notice that? Well, you start to just notice that's what we see coming up, I think, in symptoms of depression, symptoms of languishing. Adam Grant talked about that languishing. It was such a brilliant word to put on, because I'm not really depressed, but I'm just kind of like, I think that we start to just, again, those seeds were there. We probably noticed them a little bit, but I think now we've got a beautiful invitation to say, because then the pandemic sort of shifted everything. So now we don't have an excuse. Like before, it was like this culturally just sort of happened to us, this sort of perfect storm, right, of good things in some ways, more globalization, more technology, not all bad. But all of a sudden, we're seeing the side effects of too much disconnection. All of that. So in some ways, I think there was a way in which we couldn't have known what we know until you know it. But then now realizing, wait a minute, we are all realizing we need connection. We need to be known. We need real on the ground people. And we have to. So how do we know? Am I turning to social media for my relational support? How much am I scrolling? How much am I connecting to people in my everyday life? Do I have people who know me, that see me regularly? Some of those things. It's a big question. There's a lot to unpack there, but.
Yeah, and I'd love to just build a foundation for the conversation today, because not only are you a professional therapist, but you've experienced a lot of trauma in the last little bit. I'd actually like to start there with your story. You had a very traumatic experience recently. To the extent you're comfortable sharing, take us in. What happened?
Yeah, and some of that, what I was getting at prior. So during the pandemic, my family and I, when everything in Boston shut down, we ended up back in the little town that I was born and raised in, again, which was this little town of just this community. And I began to taste again, ironically for me, I began to taste again what it felt like to be like, oh, I know my grocer, I know my mail person, and that really beautiful feeling of belonging. But amidst that backdrop, I had a medical crisis out of the blue. We my husband and I were getting ready to go out on a quarantine date night, kind of a tailgate dinner under the stars. And as I went to prepare, just a simple task of going into the room to put makeup on, I couldn't move essentially my left finger. And it was the weirdest feeling, right? It probably wasn't very long. It was probably a few seconds. It felt like hours of just staring at my finger going, I can't move it. My brain, whatever cues your brain sends to your body to move aren't working. Realizing, all of a sudden, this is really terrifying. This isn't normal. Started screaming for my husband. And then sure enough, as he came in, the whole left side of my body wouldn't move or work. And we both knew that I was having a stroke. I was in my 40s. No known medical conditions, no reason for this to happen whatsoever. We're driving down, we're in this little town in which I grew up where my husband is just, we don't know, it's a little hospital. It's the middle of the pandemic. We don't even know if so he puts me in the car. I just remember having flashes. We're driving down the main street. I used to cruise, in high school. And it was just so surreal. I was like, I don't know what's happening to me. And here we are in this place that, I'm reacquainting myself with. Anyway, long story short, I was okay. They were able to get me the clot blasting medication that if you get really quickly for someone having a stroke, it mitigates a lot of the side effects. But super scary. Was in the ER for a few days, ended up having to go via helicopter to a larger hospital, which I'd never done before. It was definitely a trauma in the sense of the unexpected, out of the blue, not really a good reason for it, which actually makes it even harder because you don't have something to blame it on. Took me months, and it happened right as I was writing this book. So it was really an interesting sort of confluence of events.
So what did healing look like for you? And I don't simply mean physically. I mean, you're looking at yourself in the mirror every day, and I'm sure not only in trauma recovery, I love the fact in your book that you alluded to Bessel van der Kolk's book, and I think it's seminal for so many of us in recognizing that the body is so key to understanding wholeness and transformation, et cetera. But I'd love to know, what did healing look like for you? And here's the reason I ask that. You're a professional. You know the right questions to ask. You ask these questions of others. But when you're faced with the issues of the heart, trauma, and everything along with that, what does Dr. Alison Cook do about it?
Yeah, it was hard because I'm someone who walks other people through that. I know all the right answers, and there was a part of me that was fascinated because physically I was okay. But emotionally and mentally I was shook, deeply shook, and spiritually shook. And so I was really shaken up. So a part of me wanted to analyze my reactions, right? To sort of play the armchair therapist for myself, and that doesn't lead to healing. And so I had to surrender to the very same process that I walk other people through. And it was hard. So I did reach out to a therapist for support because I was aware, I was like, oh, I'm going to analyze my way through this, and that's not going to get me. I need to actually surrender to the process of bearing witness to the fear, the terror, the existential questions, what God does let. That was, for me, what was so fascinating when I was driving down Main Street, terrified, spiritually, I was like, well, I should feel comforted by God, but really what I feel is God lets terrible things happen. So it wasn't a source of comfort. So that became an area that was very interesting to me. There was just a whole process I had to go through. And then once I surrendered to that, at first the first week I was just like, I don't want to go through this. I just want to be okay. Once I surrendered to this is going to be a process. Even if I know and have all the answers of what the process is, doesn't matter. I still have to go through it. I went through it, and it was several months of just paying attention, noticing the different feelings, noticing all the questions that came up, validating, honoring, all the things that I teach other people. But then even after I started to feel better, a year later, it was fascinating what we know about trauma and the body keeping the score is all of a sudden come August, it happened in September, I started to feel anxious again. I started to notice different things, like going into the bathroom, putting makeup on. There were wildfires. It was the end of the summer in the West. So the burnt orange smell was giving me anxiety, like, oh, that's going to make me have a stroke. Or, just different things about fall coming. Oh, that's going to make, right? My body started to pay attention to those seasonal cues and tell me, create a narrative, which trauma does, that this is going to cause the stroke. And it was so, again, okay, this is what the body does, just slowing it down, getting really gentle with myself, being curious, noticing, not shame. This is just what the body has to do on its journey toward healing.
The trauma brain. Vander Kolk talks so much about that in his book about traumatic memories and really the release of adrenaline. He had a brilliant case study in the book about the Harvard students, and he started interviewing them, I think, in their 20s or something like that, and had no idea when they did this study that World War II was going to come on. And they later interviewed the men who were still living, and those who had traumatic experiences were able to recall incredible detail. And Vander Kolk talks about the reason why, and that's adrenaline secretion. In the experiences. So that's fascinating. And we can put a pin in that if it'd be helpful for folks. But you said something earlier that I'd love to unpack for people today, and that is one word, and it is surrender. Now, that's been so key to my own journey of transformation and healing as well. But I'd like to propose that for some people, when they hear the word surrender, that causes a little bit of self-protection, the reflex of, no, I've already been hurt by people. I've already been hurt by circumstances. I've already been hurt by God himself. Why in the world would I want to open myself up in a vulnerable fashion through surrender to potentially experience more pain? So what do? Neurobiologically, the reflex is we insulate and isolate. So talk about surrender in your own life. What did it look like? And how do we surrender? What are we surrendering to?
Yeah, it's a great question, because those protective parts of us, right, that want to be in charge, that want to be, for me, and personally, mine show up as, I can do this by myself. I can muscle my way through this. I can be self-sufficient, which is all in that, right? So it's surrendering to, I need help. I need support. I can't do it alone. I have to surrender to a process. Now, the truth is, for folks who we don't want to just surrender to anything. I had enough resources to be able to remind myself, oh no, wait a minute. Let's make sure we're surrendering, to the process in a way where we build in structures and with people that we trust. You don't want to surrender blindly. You don't want to place yourself in the hands of someone blindly, which I get into in the book, sort of that blind trust. But so I had to get past that sort of that I can do this. I can be self-sufficient. I want to just get through the process. Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm going to have to go through it. What's the best way? What do I bring around me? What's the help that I need? What's the support I need so that I can let go and those protective parts of me can relax and understand that this is a safe process and a proven process,
This is so fascinating. We're just going to go down the rabbit hole a little bit, because necessary for surrender, I believe, is what you said. It's trust. So when trust has been broken, when betrayal has been experienced in life, when there is a fundamental absence of trust in our lives, and folks, let's just be really honest, because we don't need to slap Christianese on this. When we've experienced pain, loss, crisis, and disappointment, raise your hand right now, except if you're driving. Keep your hands on the wheel. If you've experienced trust issues with the Lord himself, like, wait a minute, I thought you said this doesn't happen. So, Alison, how do we re-anchor our hearts in trust in the nature of a God who says, I do not change, which then fortifies our ability to surrender? I think of it this way. Perfect love casts out fear. But in the absence of perfect love, how will we trust? Then how will we surrender? What are your thoughts about all that, trust and surrender?
Yeah, I think there's real wisdom in what you're saying. Number one, we don't surrender to someone who's betrayed us. We don't surrender blindly. I love how you put that, because even things like, although, I did it wasn't necessarily surrendering to any one person. I had to surrender primarily within myself, um, and then a few people, even, the doctors, and again, doctors aren't perfect. Doctors will get it wrong, right? But surrender, so there's this interplay of, and I do talk about this in the book, of my own discernment, right? And coupled with really strategically reaching out for the support that I need, and then gauging that again against my own wisdom, my own spirit-led discernment. I'm going to make mistakes, but so in a concrete, so first I was like, do I need to be in bubble wrap for 2 weeks? Can I walk? And my doctor's saying, no, it's okay, you can walk. I wouldn't ride a bike because you're on blood thinners, but you can take a walk. Okay, well, that was, okay, well, I kind of trust you, but I'm not gonna, so maybe I'll just walk a little bit, and then okay, testing that against myself and my own. So constantly, same with a therapist. Therapists make mistakes, so I'm a person of faith. The woman I was seeing is not. She was great about it, but there were things where I was having some spiritual questions, like testing that against my own. So there's that interplay. It's not, and again, this is where trust, just like healing is not a one-time event. Trust, it's a process, right? It's learning, and then when you bring it to God, again, I knew that God was good, but that there's intellectual knowledge, and that's what was so profound out of this. That theological knowledge didn't help at all. Like that, when you're in the middle of like a crisis of head knowledge, doesn't comfort you. And that was really interesting to me. And so moving into a whole body sort of trust that is much more of a surrender than it is a certainty, that is much more of a hands open. I don't know, and I also know, and that it just, I felt it moving deep into my body. It wasn't a theological or an intellectual, like this explains everything that happened. Trust came into almost a release, again, a surrender, of, okay, I don't know some of the answers here. And also I can still operate from a place of fundamentally trusting the goodness of God.
Well, that's really good. Okay, so I just trying to run a thread through what you said for folks, because there comes a place in all of our lives, I believe, where we're relearning trust, we're learning how to surrender. But I think what I heard you say is, and folks, I think you can take this home with you. What I heard you say, Alison, is you were surrendering more to a process, and that process would take time. That process of transformation would require your being present. It would require change. It would require discomfort. It would require the willingness to attach your heart to hope again. Am I hearing you correctly in that?
That's great. I love that. I love that, Chris, that it's surrendering to a process. And the process, we talk about in therapy, and I think in spirituality, this process of order, disorder, and then reordering, right?
Yes.
That there's this way we've been doing things that gets disrupted, whether because of a trauma or maybe because we just decide we need to change some unhealthy patterns. There's this disordering that's uncomfortable, and all the thread through that process. And then there's a reordering of, okay, what's the new place at which I've arrived? That process of healing, whether it's, whatever it's related to, it's absolutely, there is that surrender to a process that is nuanced and is messy and involves, like, I can look at my process in those, like, say 3 months, and there's different figures. Each one played a part in it, and I played a big part in it, and God played a big part in it. But really it was that whole process of giving myself permission to say something happened that has changed the order of things. I now have to go down the road of disorder, of discomfort. And I can do that knowing that I will come out in a better place if I go through that, if I trust that process, if I go through that process.
Okay, so this is really interesting, and I'm not intending to wax philosophical here, but and actually, first I'll ask this. Is that three-phase approach, is that Carl Jung?
I was going to say
Jungian
roar, but he
psychology?
might have gotten it from you.
Okay.
So I'm
I
not
just,
sure.
yeah, because I think
Yeah.
in life, that three-phase approach is so present
Yeah.
in so many different domains of life, and
Yeah.
it just poked the question. But here's what I wonder then, because you're talking about this necessary process of disorder. Could it be that the pathway of peace requires pain?
Oh, I think it does. I think we have to face pain to
Because if
get
we
to.
don't, what happens?
If we don't face pain, we risk either living a very superficial existence of numbing, of staying very sort of, on top. To stay on top of the pain, we have to numb somehow. Or if we don't face it, it overtakes us and we only live.
Yeah.
We start to live in pain. If we go through pain, if we face it and we learn how to make friends with it, paradoxically,
Yeah.
we start to find peace.
That's so good. Okay, so I want to spring off of that and ask you to share with folks your heart on what we talked about before we record here. And that's that healing and transformation rarely happens in a day. But
Yeah.
instead, daily. Again, we're back to this is a process. What do we need to know about the practice and the process of healing?
Yeah, healing is a practice, I believe, on every level. It's a way of being. It's not a one-time event. I think I came out of it, depending on, there's a lot of different ways that we can have this idea that healing is sort of this magic zap of the wand. I came out of a faith tradition where sometimes it felt that way. It's like, well, I'm a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. And it was like, well, that's a lifetime process, actually. So there's a lot of different ways that message comes to us. But in my own experience, and even prior to this stroke, I had to learn that healing is an everyday paying attention to the contents of my own soul, to my emotions, to my body, to my spirit, to what is happening in me. And it is sort of a daily surrender, really. I mean, sometimes in our lives, it's just more obvious. It's more dramatic, but it really is a daily surrender to this is where I am right now. This is what's going on with me right now. Not trying to deny that, not trying to bypass that, not trying to pretend. This is what's true. This is what's true right now, today. This is what I'm facing. This is what's hard. This is what's good. Okay, let's surrender to the process of the day. It's unbelievable how that root of getting really honest with yourself, with what's happening, with who you are, with the variables that you're dealing with, is actually the path, again, as you said, to peace. Is actually, I talk about in the last chapter, how will I know I've arrived? Is a question people ask me at the end of, as a therapist, well, when am I there? And I'm like, well, you're there when you know you're not, and you're at peace with that. And you know that we'll never fully arrive. I'll never just become, hopefully we're moving incrementally toward deeper and deeper and deeper levels of becoming more true to ourselves, more true, authentic, beautiful souls that God made us to become. But that is a practice and a process every single day of my life.
I could have never planned for this to happen in the conversation, but I just love the way the Holy Spirit works and how conversations evolve, because folks, listen, Dr. Alison Cook has just given us 3 key principles now. We talked about surrender, then we talked about rebuilding trust. But what's required of both of those? And what I just heard you say is truth and honesty. Folks, we've talked about here on the podcast a million times with Jamie Winship, confession is not necessarily and always saying you're sorry. It's telling the truth. What is it, Alison, about the power of honesty and truth that opens us up for relearning trust, being willing to enter into the process of surrender, and because of the presence of trust, saying, I know change is costly. I know there's going to be pain involved, but I'm going to be better on the other side. You want to connect those thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the first thought that came to my mind was Jesus saying the truth will set you free. And I think there's just truth in that on a myriad of levels. But in my own experience of telling the truth of our experiences. That is the road. That is, and sometimes it's painful. That, sometimes the beginning of that road. I'm a hiker, and I talk a lot about how when you're hiking in the wilderness and there's a trailhead, right? There's a sign that says this is the trail you need to go down. It's 6 miles, to this beautiful lake or this beautiful peak. Well, that trail is going to be treacherous at times. You don't want to go down that trail, but there's your trust. Again, I love what you're saying. There's a process you're going to go through. You're going to trust that trail's, and you're telling yourself the truth. You're saying, okay, here I am. If I'm going to go down this trail, this is the trail I want to go down. I want to get to that point. I better take really honest inventory about where I am right now. Because if I have a broken leg and I head down on that trail, well, I'm not going to get very far. Or if I'm by myself and have no one to guide me, and that's the metaphor. But in my life, it's like, I want to get here. That's where I want to go. Well, I better start with where am I right now?
Yes.
Because if I'm not ruthlessly honest, not ruthlessly, but relentlessly honest with myself about where there's some blind spots, about where I need to get more support, about what's hard, about am I ready to take this path, I can't get there. I will not get there. I will end up creating a worse problem for myself. And so I do think in my own life that just that honesty and it's painful at first. Sometimes it's hard to face the things that we don't want to face about ourselves, about our circumstances. But how do you heal what you can't name? How do you heal what you don't bring into the light?
Mm-hmm. How do you heal that which you don't bring into the light? Folks, I want you to sit on that for just a moment, because some of you right now, because of the presence of fear and shame and guilt in your lives, are stuck, and you're saying, I'm doing all the right things, but I'm getting the same result. Well, could it be that the presence of fear, shame, guilt are keeping you locked in a place of saying, I'm unwilling to face honestly what has happened? This is the power of naming circumstances, naming emotions. That gives us the ability to move forward, right?
Absolutely. And even naming the shame, some days on this process and practice, some days, if I'm not in a great place and we think, well, I got to get to that better place. So how do I get to that better place? Well, sometimes I'll start with, I feel lousy, and not to stay there, or I'm dealing with shame. And again, that's a spiritual practice, because I'm not naming that. I'm naming that like in my journal, or I'm telling God that, or I'm saying I need to tell a friend this. I need to tell my spouse this. Because the minute I start to name that, the minute, to name is to tame, as Dan Siegel says. The minute we begin to name, not just to dwell, not to say, it's not the victim name, that's not the naming that we're describing. It's not just, I'm just always destined to be, no, it's like, we have started to move toward honesty. We have started to move down, because we've just, again, it's that surrender. This is where I am. If I try to fight it, so if I'm feeling whatever, if I'm waking up and feeling shame or sad, and so another part of me is like, well, you can't feel that way. We need to have a good day. Like, let's start fighting it, right? So immediately we have inner conflict. We have, I'm sad and I don't want to feel sad. And immediately you can just feel the nervous system get tense. There's inner conflict. It doesn't work. It's not the road. But if you wake up and I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling anxiety, or I'm feeling worry, and we say, I use the words a lot, get curious. And I get curious about that. And I say, oh, isn't that interesting? I woke up feeling lonely. I woke up feeling sad. Suddenly the nervous system relaxes. There's some, okay, all right, surrender. There's that sense of, okay, that's what's true.
Yes.
What do I need to bring in to care for myself in that?
Yeah.
And we're going to be far more creative, far more capable when we're in that place of acceptance. And that's what, this gets to self-acceptance. Self-acceptance isn't, it's actually a really nuanced practice of this is where I am today. And if I can kind of embrace that and say, start there, surrender to that, I'm actually going to have more resources to be able to move into a better place, as opposed to when I shame, guilt, bypass, deny. That takes a lot of energy, which takes away from the energy to actually bring in the resources we need.
That's so helpful, because one of the stakes I want to put in the ground with you today may sound like it flies in the face of what many Christ followers, many of us have just heard and have believed for years, which is this. We can't continue to disregard ourselves for the sake of others. Really, that's an adaptation of your own words. You give us great insight on this in your book. I'd love for you to teach us more.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, it absolutely gets into the work of the best of you, which is the work of kind of what I've had to learn, that paying attention. So a lot of us are taught we should just disregard, deny, bypass. And I get it. I mean, I don't mean, and what I talk about in the book is this idea of there are 3 relationships, I believe, in my from my background, which are, we have a relationship with God, we have a relationship with other people, and we have a relationship with ourselves. And it's that relationship with ourselves that I think, in many ways understand the least. We think it means, it's either a really superficial understanding, or it's I should just not think about myself. I should deny myself. I should disregard myself. Well, in fact, we do need to have a healthy relationship with other people, with God, and with ourselves, because how do we have a healthy relationship with other people if we are not bringing the best of ourselves into that relationship, the most honest version of ourselves into that relationship? So one of the ways I delineate that in the book is there's selfishness, which is it's all about me.
Yeah.
I only focus on myself.
Right.
I only think about me. I only, I'm the only one that matters. There's this other extreme, which is a misunderstanding of what it means to be selfless, which is it's never about me. I should always make it about other people, which is not the example we see in Jesus. It's not the selflessness we see there, but it's what some of us have been misinterpreted to be. I should never think about myself. And then there's this category in psychology, selfhood. Selfhood, the archetype of the self that Jung talks about, which is the more I understand myself, the more I can name the contents of my own heart, soul, mind, what's going on in my body, the more I kind of welcome the different parts of myself, the more I embrace the different parts of myself, the more you are doing that work, the more you are understanding, honoring, embracing the different parts of your work. Guess what? We show up together as 2 people who can have a fantastic relationship, because it's then about me and you. And together, we begin to create and negotiate a beautiful relationship that honors both of us. So selfhood allows for me and you. It allows for both of us. Every relationship has 2 people, and both of those people have to bring who they really are to the table. And then comes the work of compromise, and, not just in romantic relationships, all relationships, friendships.
Yes.
Then comes the work of partnership. But you can't partner with another human, or even with God. I think our relationship with God is also a partnership if you do not know what you are bringing into that relationship, both the good, the bad, and the hard.
Can we play this out a little bit? I've actually never heard the word selfhood. And this is fascinating to me, because now I'm thinking about the 3 pillars, if you will: selfishness, selflessness, selfhood. It seems like the 2 opposites are operating in independence, whereas selfhood is in interdependence.
That's right. Exactly.
How can you walk us through maybe some real life circumstances where many of us would be accustomed to responding a certain way, be it in a relationship or reactionary to a circumstance of adversity or something like that? How would selfhood actually show up differently? I don't know if I framed that question correctly, but you want to just give us an example of how that would play out?
Absolutely. And it relates to, I don't want to bring in more terminology, but later in the book, it relates to this idea of healthy dependence versus codependence versus counterdependence, right? So selflessness links into codependence, which is whatever you want, you want. I don't have any preferences here, which leads to typically resentment, burnout, but then the flip side of that would be, I don't care what you want. I'm going to do what I want. Selfhood would say, I guess you're looking for practical examples. healthy interdependence would be like, listen, this is what I need. So let me give you a real life example, that I'm kind of pulling out of the sky. But let's say, this is a real thing where a couple has to negotiate, and the one partner is saying, I need to, I need to live in this city in order to work, in order to have the job that I need, because I have family here. The other person is saying, I don't want to do that. I'd prefer to live here. Geography is a big thing for couples. That's that both people are being honest. This is my preference. This is my need. This is what I want. The other person isn't saying, that's fine, whatever you need. They're saying, it's not my first choice. My first choice is Florida. It's sunny there. I love the ocean. It's where I was raised. I do understand, it's honoring. I do understand that for you, Chicago has a lot better job opportunities. Your friends are there. So it's two people kind of being really honest. Again, so the selflessness would be like, what? I'll just follow you. And then 10 years down the road, you're angry because you're living in a place you hate.
Dang.
Selfishness is saying, I don't care. Selfhood, two people saying, this is what's true. I mean, bring it down to where you're going to dinner. I don't really feel like eating this tonight. It can be really small things. There's some honesty there, but there's also honoring. This isn't so important to me that I'm going to put a stake in the sand here. So I will do this thing because I love you, and because you also often do things for me. And so there's this healthy back and forth. We're not keeping score. It's not quid pro quo, but it's two people, even if you don't say it, especially in marriage or in friendship, where it's like inside of myself, I'll be like, this isn't my first choice. This isn't really what I want to do, but I know, but I want to do this because I believe in this person and I love this person. And this is a choice I am making. And so therefore I am thrilled, and I know why I'm making the choice. Even if you're not communicating it,
yes,
inside of you, that's selfhood, and therefore you can say to yourself later on, you're like, I know why I did that. I did that for a purpose. I did that for a reason. And that's where you're starting to get toward that's your health. You're healthy in those relationships. You're no longer bitter. You're just like, even when I do make sacrifices, I know why. I did it for a reason. I knew what I was giving up. I counted the cost. Maybe you negotiate with yourself and you're saying, I'm going to do this thing that's hard. Here's what I'm going to need to do for myself to enable me to do that well. That's selfhood.
My mind's a little blown right now because you're blowing paradigms that I've had about even what selflessness is. I would have used selflessness to describe perhaps what you just described, but now in thinking about the interdependence of selfhood and honoring and values, I'm like, this is really powerful. So let's turn the page on this a bit, because you had tipped your hat to healthy dependence. Mm-hmm. I think part of breaking old patterns involves reframing healthy dependence in a relationship versus, as you said, codependency. Help us understand the difference. We've heard a lot about codependency, but break that down for us and really set that up against what healthy dependence looks like. And I think you already kind of alluded to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think codependency, it is kind of this buzzy word, but really it's just, I'm going to, instead of doing my own work of honoring, understanding, knowing, caring for my own self, which is my job before God, that's the best thing that I can do for my family, for my kids, for my husband, for my friends, is to be doing the work of taking good care of myself. And that's not just a superficial thing. That's really tending and stewarding my own soul. That's the best gift that my spouse and my friends have to give me, is doing their own work. So instead of doing that, I'll shut down that work and I'll do your work for you. So that's what codependency is. I can't deal with my own stuff. So guess what? I'm going to go do that person's work. I'm going to go do my mom's work for her that she never did, by just catering to all of her needs that aren't really mine to meet. I'm going to go do my, my addicted child's work for them by just following them around, picking up all the pieces after them, right? It's not fine to help people, but you're doing that at the expense of the work that you need to do to be whole. And so that's when we flip into codependency. Healthy dependence is, I do need you in my life. I do want you in my life. I also will be okay without you. And therefore, it's the both and. Therefore, because as much as I want you in my life, and it will be so painful for me if you're not in my life, And also, I will be okay. Therefore, if you do cross some lines that are not appropriate and not fair, I will remove myself because I've done the work. So that's healthy dependence is, I want you in my life, but I won't fall apart without you because I've also done the work inside myself to be a healthy whole person.
You've just helped us understand boundary setting, I think, because
Exactly.
In my mind, I think about setting a boundary, and boundaries aren't saying, hey, you can't do that to me. It's saying, listen, you can do what you want, but if you do, this is the choice I'm going to make. Yeah. I'm establishing the fence, if you will. Is that correct? I mean, we can talk about boundaries here in a minute, but yeah, how does that play out?
Well, that was why. So it's all interwoven. All of this is interwoven, which is how the best of you became essentially, because I realized I'm like, well, I want to talk about boundaries, but you can't talk about boundaries. You can't. What I came to learn as a therapist over years and years of working with people is if you start with boundaries before you have a strong sense of self, it's impossible. Because if you don't have a strong sense of self, the idea of setting a boundary that you know you need to set just fills you with anxiety. Your nervous system can't tolerate it. You can't, it's not, you can, and then guess what you do? You beat yourself up because you can't set the healthy boundaries. So there's a pre-step. And that pre-step means, and that this is the chronology of the best of you, it means dealing with your childhood wounds, understanding the nature of trauma, understanding the nature of those fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses, understanding, getting to the root of all that before getting more of a sense of yourself, breaking out of those codependent patterns, at least naming them, before you can even begin to do the work of then the external, okay, I got to start using my voice. I got to start letting this person know that now that I understand myself and the health that I need and what I need to thrive, this is going to have to change. There's a lot of pre-work that has to happen inside of us before we get to that point of articulating in a healthy way. And again, this is where with someone else who's also doing the work, those are hard conversations, even with someone else who is doing the work. But if you're dealing with someone who's not doing the work, they become toxic conversations. So you also have to understand, there's so much to this journey of healing, this practice of healing. There's so many nuances to what is the work. And I'll say this to people feel overwhelmed, and just people listening right now, like, this is why it's a journey. This is why it's a process, why you have to understand, what am I being called to right now? I may not be able to go to the boundaries work right now. It brings up too much anxiety. That's okay. What I can do right now is just begin to name some of the emotions I feel in this relationship. That's the step I can take, is just to at least start honoring, I don't like this. This doesn't feel good. This brings tension to my body. I don't know what to do about it. That's okay. Right? And some folks might be at the point where it's like, you've done the work. It's time to be brave. It's time to start to speak up on behalf of what you need and want. So it's definitely, but if you jump too soon to boundaries, which I see people do, before we have that, we've built up those resources. We built up that sense of self inside. If we jump too quickly to boundaries, either A, they'll collapse, they won't stick. It'll be a one-off, and then you'll apologize and go right back. Or B, you might set boundaries in ways that, in places you don't, that aren't the correct places to set the boundaries.
Let's paint the picture then for folks. This is your phrase, the cocktail of codependency.
Yeah.
What does that include?
So I talk about the cocktail as childhood wounds. Because that's where we begin to form our sense of self. And in the absence of being seen, of being honored, of that healthy process of establishing, if you think about a baby, the job of a parent is to slowly and over time begin to help that baby move out and, move into autonomy, move into individuation, move into a separateness while also being connected.
Yeah.
That's those first 5, 6, 7 years of a child's life, is learning that dance of both autonomy and connectedness, that dance that is healthy dependence, right? If all of us have wounds there, but if there are big wounds there, that makes it really hard for us as adults to understand that dance of, it is about me and it's about this connection. Two things are important. if that's not in our DNA, if that didn't get absorbed into our being early on, it's really hard to understand that. So that's the first C. Then the second C is misconstrued church messages. For folks who grew up in faith communities, we get some of these church messages that, die to yourself, self is bad, emotions are bad, don't listen to, that don't, and they're misconstrued interpretations where we are to honor and steward the soul that God gave us, that was made in the image of God. It is our job to do that. And so those messages get construed to sort of, if you slap over, you've already got some woundedness, you already, didn't get really that care that you needed early on to understand what it's like to be in your own skin and to, enjoy the person that you are. If that didn't happen, and then you're going to church and they're saying, well, just die to yourself. You're like, okay, well, I never really existed anyway, so I'll just further. Oh, that's just starting to be a cocktail for, unhealthy. And then third, there's this cultural conditioning, right? And that especially, I think, applies to any folks. I talk a lot about to women in the book, but anyone who's been marginalized, anyone who has already felt sidelined. That those three C's can really create this soil in which I don't know who I am. No one's ever helped me understand who I am. So guess what? I'm just going to let you tell me who to be. I'm going to outsource my self-esteem. I'm going to outsource it to you. Now, if you get lucky and it's a good person, great. But a lot of times it's someone who is, going to exploit, betray, take advantage of, and then you're just in that stuck place.
Yeah, so I want to talk about spiritual bypassing then, because I see this a lot in scenarios around grief. And in fact, as soon as you start to explain what this is, spiritual bypassing, folks are going to nod their heads like, oh yeah, I have experienced that. Take us inside. What is it?
So spiritual bypassing is a term that basically the gist of it is we bypass, and it started actually, a psychologist coined the term with sort of some more new age kind of clients spiritualizing, but I see it all the time in Christian circles. I think it can happen. It can happen in any sort of religious context, but in a Christian context, the idea is that we slap sort of a spiritualization, a spiritual platitude, a spiritual cliche on any form of suffering, any form of pain. So we bypass what's actually happening in the name of, sort of a spiritualized cliche. So for example, I'm feeling really sad today. You shouldn't feel sad. God has, right, given you so much, or, I'm really scared. I'm fearful. Starve your fear. Fear is the enemy of your faith. Just some of these cliches that, or I'm feeling shame. We're just going to pray that away. Or I'm feeling angry. Well, you shouldn't feel angry. You can't feel angry. And it's like, well, I do. So the spiritual bypassing is any sort of spiritual platitude that tries to over spiritualize something that is a real issue that instead needs that honesty. This is what's going on. I'm naming what's real. God knows it. I know it. There's no quick way through it. In fact, some of these feelings might be important for me to pay attention to. I might be angry for a reason. So the opposite of spiritual bypassing is spiritual fruit. It's learning to be kind to yourself when you notice, fear. It's learning to be patient with yourself when you notice. It's learning to be gentle with yourself. It's not trying to shoo those things away with a quick fix platitude.
Yeah, what fuels that, do you think? For me, I tend to think a lot of us are just uncomfortable with mystery. Like, we don't like answers in life, such as, I don't know. I'll give you an example. When my mom died, she battled cancer for 18 years. 3 weeks after she passed away, Allison, I had so many people walk up to me. Well, brother, he moves in mysterious ways. Allison, I said, God didn't say that. Bono said that. They said, what? I said, yeah, he moves in mysterious ways. That's Bono's line. Oh. And I just tend to think we're not good at saying, I don't know.
Exactly.
I don't know. So we drop the platitudes. I don't think many people have malicious intent, but they ended up saying dumb things for the sake of the discomfort that they're unwilling to sit in. And is the challenge, therefore, to us in the context of relationships to be willing, like Jesus, when Lazarus died, he didn't drop platitudes. He was God. Mm-hmm. Presence, not platitudes. What are your thoughts?
Exactly. Yeah, no, I'm so sorry that happened to you, and I wish it was uncommon, but it's not.
It's so common, yeah. All things work together for good, brother. Are you kidding me? I mean, yes, of course they do, but wrong answer.
It is. I think, best case scenario, people just don't know what to say.
Yeah.
But worse, and if you don't know what to say, I think it's say nothing, just say, man, I'm sorry. This
I'm
is
so
hard.
sorry. Yes.
I am with you. Yeah. That's all, you can't go wrong. But I think at worst case scenario, I do think people who, again, it gets back to the beginning of our conversation. If you're not willing to face your own pain,
that's it.
How can you walk with someone in theirs?
That's it.
You can't. And so if you've been treating yourself that way, well, I can't feel pain because, by burying it or by covering over it, that's how you're going to treat other people and their pain.
Yes. Yeah. Alison, you wrote, you can trust God and still feel anxious, lonely, overwhelmed, and broken inside. The question many people are asking is how?
Well, I think, you mean, why does that happen? Why do we trust God and still feel that way inside?
That is, when I read that statement in your book, I thought, boy, that's really good. That's truth. But that's prickly for people. Mm-hmm. When you hear it, it's like, oh, that sounds really good. Mm-hmm. But when you have to live with that, and people are going, I don't know how to engage with this in truth. Like, how do I trust God and still feel anxious? Because, like we said, and maybe this plays into what we talked about regarding dropping the platitudes. Well, if you really trusted God, you wouldn't feel. Or, hey, brother, the joy of the Lord is your strength. Or, hey, whatever. Mm-hmm. Where does trust and anxiety, maybe this is the better question, where does trust and loneliness, where does trust and anxiety, where does trust and overwhelm occupy the same space of heart?
Yeah. No, it's a deep question. And I think the first thought I had is I think of almost every single story in scripture of, for example, Jesus, in his anguish in the garden, totally trusting God and feeling incredible angst on so many occasions. So we know that it's real. And I think it does get at this idea that we are whole people, mind, body, emotion, spirit. And so even if spiritually we know God, kind of that whole body, like again, going back to my story, the more and more I'm like, okay, God, I trust that you are good. And I am still really scared. Two things can be true at once. Yeah. And maybe the process, maybe this is the process of becoming more and more of a human in the sense of, and I think of becoming more and more of a human as a good thing. And I get that from, N.T. Wright talks about we actually are supposed to become whole humans. We're humaning is good. I think it got a bad rap with the sort of secular humanism, but that was the stuff that I just really drew me as a psychologist was like, selfhood becoming, but maybe that's part of becoming even more of a human is more and more and more that trust, that deep whole body trust does start over time. By the time we're 70, 80, 90, maybe it does start. I think it does. We do grow. We do see incremental, like, okay, I still worry, but I notice that I'm more able to be kind to myself in that worry, right? Yeah. But again, that's a practice, a process, more than it's a zap of the wand. And the paradox is that if we are looking for the quick hit, we won't get there. But if we are trusting God and being really honest about, and I still feel really empty, broken, and depressed inside, ironically and paradoxically, that is how we begin to bring more of the goodness, the more of God's presence, God's witness, not the pat answers, not the certainty, but the witness of God into those spaces of our souls that still just haven't experienced that yet. We're vast people, you know, there's a lot to us, and it takes a little while, a whole lifetime probably, for all that witness, you know, to begin to seep into the marrow of every part of us.
That's so rich. When I hear you say the witness, it reminds me so much of Kurt Thompson, and I love Kurt so much, and just thankful for conversations like that. Hey, tell me about the spectrum of toxicity in relationships.
So this kind of gets at when we're kind of doing the work. We're noticing where we've had some wounds. We're kind of learning to, you know, bring more of who we are into that honest, authentic place. We start to use our voice. We start to realize, you know, I'm realizing that this relationship, you know, is not healthy for me, or aspects of this relationship aren't healthy for me. Well, this is where, you know, again, my little therapist hat, you know, it's like, well, I'm going to tell the person, and my little therapist hat is like, pause, because is the person someone who can hear that? Is the person someone who has the resources to have that conversation with you, or is the person someone who is going to use this information against you? And I hate it that I have to be the person but I've seen too much, you know, and even pastors, you know, who want to go talk to someone in there, you know, it's like, let's think about what resources they have. Are they going to come into this conversation, whoever it is, whether it's a friend, whatever.
Yes.
Can you have a healthy conversation with this person, or is this person going to continue to respond in a manipulative, guilt tripping, all the, you know, the big buzzy words, gaslighting, all the things? These are real. I mean, people are talking about them because if you bump into somebody who is living more out of that side of the spectrum, so the spectrum of toxicity is like, you're dealing with some folks who are on that healthy side of the spectrum. They're not perfect, but they can have a conversation with you. They can hear you. They can try to make changes. They can try to own their mistakes. There's humility, right? When you start veering into that toxic side of the spectrum, every single time it's like, no, I didn't. There's defensiveness. There's blame shifting. There's guilt tripping. There's all the things. You need to know that, because you're going to deal with that person in a different way than you're going to deal with somebody with whom you can have a healthy conversation. And so that spectrum is just a way to help people understand. Let's be wise as you go into this conversation, because people show you who they are. Mm-hmm. They do over time. Their patterns of behavior over time show you who they are. And if they've shown you pattern after pattern after pattern of behavior that they cannot hear you, then you're just going to set yourself up for failure if you aren't honest about that. And you need to use a different strategy in that situation.
I didn't tell you this before we hit record, but I've had a couple dozen listeners email me, and they said, you got to have Dr. Alison Cook on. So, folks, you're welcome. Here she is. But what's interesting is they all ask me to ask you to talk to us about internal family systems and the model of therapy.
Yeah. Sure.
Just talk to us about how it works, the effectiveness of it. I have a good friend who's an LPC here in the Detroit area, and he uses IFS as his model. But I am fascinated by it, and I'd love to answer that question for folks.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's the topic of my first book, so I haven't been asked about that as much lately, and I love it. It's all woven throughout because it's the parts language, right? So internal family systems, it's just a model of therapy. The best depiction is the Pixar movie Inside Out. If you want to go see that movie with the little, a lot of people with the little parts, right, inside each of the characters' mind. But the idea is we are multifaceted. There are different parts of us. And we have protective parts. We were talking about that earlier, right? Those protective parts that want to be self-sufficient, that like, I can do this. I can get the job done. We have parts of us that want to check out, that want to numb, that want to escape. Those are the spiritual bypassing parts often. Those are the parts of us that would rather, reach for the glass of wine than sit with the hard thing.
Yeah.
And then we have these tender, exiled, vulnerable parts of us, the parts of us that are hurting, the parts of us that carry the wounds of the past, the parts of us that are grieving, the parts of us that we often try to shove aside. And the whole thing with the model is that those are the three categories of parts. All of them have a place. We need all three of them. And the goal is harmony. The goal is balance. The goal is We need to pull those tender parts of us in closer, not push them aside. We need to learn the parts of us that want to check out. We need to learn how to reach for healthy comfort, healthy pleasure when we need to unwind, because we do. And then those protector parts, we need to just keep them in check, not let them take over. They're the ones that want to, just take charge. We need to kind of, okay, now's not the time to be self-sufficient. Now's the time to take a deep breath. So the model is just this: we have an internal family, and our job is to lead those parts of us well.
It's so cool. Richard Schwartz was the founder of that, right?
That's right.
Oh, fun. Well, listen.
Yeah, he's amazing. He founded it, and it's just grown and grown and grown. And I think he started in the 70s, early 80s, and it's just grown and taken off like wildfire, because it really works. It makes sense, and it helps you. We're complicated, so it helps you. It gives you this, like, because it's like, well, who are you? Well, I'm a lot of different things, you know. Yep. So it gives you language.
That's good. Well, I'd love to land here with you today. We are headed for the holidays, and honestly, I could spend another hour or so with you just on this topic. But this time of year, for many people, it's hard. They're grieving. They're reminded of the loss of a loved one. So, like I said, for many, this is not a happy time of year at all. They walk into your office. What do you say to them?
Well, first, just to honor the part that is grieving, right? Because usually what happens with the holidays is, and I love that we're ending right after talking about the parts, is we're conflicted. I should feel happy. It's the holidays. I should feel joy. But a part of me is so sad. A part of me can barely face this day, because of loss, whatever. And so to honor that, first of all, that conflict, to name the different, and again, it gets back to what we talked about earlier. When you are feeling like, I'm not looking forward to this, or I feel overwhelmed, or I feel so lonely, right? It's, can you be with that part of you without shame? Can you be with that part of you without trying to beat yourself up? Can you be with that part of you with gentleness, with compassion, with kindness, at the very least with curiosity? I'm just curious about it. Sometimes that's an easier one. And just honor it with the honesty. And then from there, it's okay. That's where we are. That's where we are. It's okay. What is it? What's one thing I could do? What's one thing I could do to honor that part of me on Thanksgiving? What's one thing I could do to just honor? Maybe I do have to show up at the family dinner. It's going to be hard. I don't want to cry my way through it. So what's one way that I could just honor that grieving part of me today? And really listening and paying attention to what you need to honor that.
Thank you for that. Your brand new book, The Best of You, is available right now everywhere books are sold. Folks, go to the show notes at wintoday.tv. Listen, Christmas is 3 weeks away. We just moved through Thanksgiving. I've got the perfect stocking stuffer for you, and I think it is Dr. Alison Cook's brand new book. So, Alison, I can't thank you enough for today's conversation. Just remarkable, and your work has really added value to me. And after today's conversation, I know many more. So I appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated the conversation.
Thank you so much. Listen, I'd love for you to tell people how to stay connected to you. And you have a great podcast as well, so I'd love to promote that as well.
Yeah, probably the best way, dralisoncook.com is my website, and I send out a weekly email on Thursdays. I have a podcast where I talk about all these things called the Best of You podcast.
That's great.
You can find it wherever podcasts are, but dralisoncook.com is sort of the best way, where everything is.
Wonderful. Anything else today?
No, just appreciate you.
Thanks, Alison.
Appreciate the work you're doing. It's so important, so good. Thank you for honoring these conversations and having them and bringing this to so many people. It's so important.
It's so important to me. Healing and transformation is the passion of my life. So you've been a great blessing to me today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.